Beat me in chess, and I'll marry you, smirked the CEO, her voice echoing across the sleek marble floor of the corporate lobby. A small crowd of employees gasped and chuckled, convinced it was a joke. After all, who would take such a bold statement seriously? Especially when it was aimed at a man who swept floors and emptied trash bins for a living. That man was David Carter. The janitor. The one everyone barely noticed, except when he pushed his squeaky cart through the hallways at night. His uniform was faded, his shoes scuffed, but behind his quiet demeanor was a mind sharper than anyone could imagine. But before we get to the game that silenced an entire company and changed 2 lives forever, let me take you back to where this story truly begins. David wasn't always a janitor. He had dreams once, dreams bigger than the tall glass buildings he now cleaned every evening. Born and raised in Atlanta, he was the youngest of 3 siblings in a family that struggled to make ends meet. His father was a mechanic who worked long shifts, and his mother stitched clothes at home to add a little extra income. David loved books, especially the ones about strategy, puzzles, and logic. At 10 years old, he stumbled upon an old chess set at a yard sale. The pieces were chipped and missing paint, but to David, it was treasure. He taught himself the game by reading borrowed library books. Soon, he was playing against anyone who dared, from kids in the neighborhood to older men at the park. It didn't take long before he was beating them all. By 16, he was recognized as the best young player in the county. But dreams don't always survive in the face of hardship. A tragedy struck when his father fell ill and medical bills mounted higher than their hopes. College became impossible. David gave up his scholarships, his tournaments, his future, so that his family could survive. He worked jobs that kept the lights on, but none that let his mind shine. Now, at 37, David found himself mopping the floors of a company he once dreamed of leading. He carried no bitterness on his face, though inside, a quiet storm brewed. Chess remained his private refuge. At night, after his shift, he would pull out the same worn board and practice moves against imaginary opponents. It wasn't about trophies anymore, it was about keeping a part of himself alive. Enter Caroline Blake. The CEO. She was everything David was not in the eyes of the world, powerful, glamorous, and respected. At only 35, she had taken her father's crumbling logistics company and turned it into a billion-dollar empire. She had a reputation for being ruthless in business but charming in public, always with a witty remark that left people hanging on her every word. Caroline, however, carried a loneliness few knew about. She had grown up in wealth but not warmth. Success had been her only way of earning her father's approval, and when he passed, she was left with an empire but no one to truly share it with. Suitors flocked to her, but most were after her money or her influence. She pushed them all away with sarcasm, often joking that if anyone could beat her at chess, she might just consider marriage. To her, it was a way of keeping people at arm's length. One rainy evening, Caroline stayed late at the office. She had just wrapped up a board meeting and walked into the lobby, where David was polishing the floor. A small wooden chessboard sat on a side table by the couches, left behind by one of the junior employees who liked to play during breaks. Caroline, curious and restless, sat down and absent-mindedly began setting up the pieces. David noticed, and for the first time in weeks, allowed himself to speak more than polite greetings. "You play?" he asked softly, leaning on his mop. Caroline glanced up, half amused. "A little. I've been told I'm decent." Her tone carried that effortless confidence of someone used to winning. David hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Decent is good. But chess doesn't like pride." That line caught her attention. She raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "And you'd know this because..." He paused, his eyes lowering. "Because I've lived it." Something about his tone made her lean forward. There was no arrogance, just truth. In that moment, she smirked, her playful arrogance slipping through. "All right then, Mr. Janitor. Beat me in chess, and I'll marry you." The words tumbled out half as a joke, half as a test. A few employees lingering nearby heard her and laughed, whispering to each other. Caroline expected David to laugh it off too, maybe even blush. But he didn't. He simply nodded, eyes steady, as though she had just offered him something sacred. "I accept," he said. The room went quiet. No one knew what to say. Caroline chuckled nervously, not expecting him to call her bluff. "You're serious?" "As serious as the game," David replied. The employees now leaned in, eager for the show. One of them rushed to set up the chessboard properly, pieces in their starting positions. Caroline straightened her blazer, brushing off her earlier unease. She thrived on challenges, and though she had never been a master, she knew enough to hold her ground. What she didn't know was that David had been waiting for a moment like this his whole life. They sat down across from each other. Caroline's smirk returned. "Don't take it too hard if you lose. After all, you're playing against a CEO, not just anyone." David didn't answer. His silence was unsettling, his eyes fixed on the board like a soldier studying a battlefield. The crowd formed a semicircle around them, whispering bets, phones quietly recording. Caroline made her first move confidently, pawn to e4. David, calm as still water, responded instantly. Pawn to e5. Caroline followed with her knight, knight to f3. Without hesitation, David's queen slid out, queen to h4. The employees leaned closer, their laughter turning into murmurs. Some recognized the unfolding pattern, others just watched with curiosity. Caroline frowned, not yet seeing the danger. She pushed her pawn forward to defend, but David's knight leapt into position. And then, it happened. 3 moves later, checkmate. The room erupted. Gasps, laughter, stunned silence. Caroline stared at the board, disbelief washing over her face. The woman who had bested CEOs, politicians, and investors in negotiation had just been defeated in less than 5 minutes, by her janitor. Her cheeks flushed, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, humility. She looked up at David, who simply leaned back, his expression unreadable. He wasn't gloating, wasn't mocking. He just sat there, as if the win meant nothing, or perhaps everything. For Caroline, it was the beginning of questions she had never dared to ask herself. For David, it was the first crack of light in a life long shadowed by sacrifice. And for everyone watching, it was a story they would never forget. The lobby buzzed with disbelief. Employees exchanged wide-eyed glances, whispering to one another as if they had just witnessed the impossible. Some chuckled nervously, others clapped softly, not knowing if they should cheer or stay quiet under their CEO's gaze. Caroline sat frozen, staring at the board, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering above the captured pieces as though they might explain what had just happened. "How?" she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. 3 moves. That's ridiculous." David finally broke his silence. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "It's called the fool's mate. Simple, but often overlooked. Sometimes the biggest mistakes come from thinking you're too smart to make them." The words weren't meant to sting, but they did. Caroline felt something heavy shift inside her chest. She was used to winning, to controlling the outcome. But here she was, humbled in front of her employees by a man everyone overlooked. "Guess I owe you a wedding ring, huh?" Caroline said, forcing a laugh to save face. The crowd chuckled with her, easing the tension. But as the laughter faded, her eyes lingered on David's, and she realized there was more depth there than she'd ever noticed in anyone else. David smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Don't worry. I don't plan on holding you to that." But Caroline, for reasons she couldn't quite explain, felt almost disappointed at his words. The night ended with the crowd dispersing, phones buzzing with texts about the unexpected showdown. Caroline excused herself, retreating upstairs to her office, but she couldn't focus. She kept replaying the game in her mind, not just the moves, but the look on David's face. Calm, certain, unshaken. She had spent her life commanding rooms with her presence, yet for the first time, someone had commanded her attention without trying. Meanwhile, David went back to his work quietly, pushing his mop as though nothing had happened. But inside, his heart pounded. He hadn't just beaten a CEO, he had reminded himself of who he once was. A man who could see patterns others missed, who could think 5 steps ahead. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. The next morning, the story spread across the office like wildfire. Employees whispered about it in elevators, joked about it in emails, and secretly admired David's nerve. Some called it luck, others genius, but no one could stop talking about it. Caroline walked into the office with her usual composure, but inside, she was restless. That night replayed in her dreams, each move echoing louder than the last. She wasn't embarrassed, she was curious. Who was this janitor, really? How could someone with so much talent end up polishing floors? At lunch, instead of dining with executives, Caroline made her way to the basement, where David was sorting cleaning supplies. He looked up, surprised to see her. "Ms. Blake," he said, straightening. "Caroline," she corrected. "At least when it's just us." David hesitated, then nodded. "Caroline." She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, studying him. "You don't belong here." David frowned slightly. "With respect, it's honest work." "I don't mean that," she replied quickly. "I mean, you have a mind most people can't match. You could be running a department, designing strategies, not scrubbing tile. Why are you here?" David lowered his gaze, silent for a long moment. Then he spoke softly. "Because life doesn't always care about what you're good at. Sometimes it just cares about what you're willing to sacrifice." Caroline felt the weight of his words settle over her. She wanted to press further, but something in his eyes told her the story was too deep to unravel in one sitting. So instead, she simply said, "Play me again. Tonight. After everyone's gone." David almost chuckled. "You sure about that?" "Very sure," she said firmly. "And this time, no 3-move tricks. I want to see what you can really do." That evening, when the office emptied, Caroline and David sat down at the same lobby table. The atmosphere was different now, no audience, no laughter, just 2 people facing each other over 64 squares of battle. The game lasted nearly an hour. Caroline played fiercely, focusing with all her might, but David's strategies unfolded like poetry. Every time she thought she had him cornered, he revealed a hidden path. When she finally tipped her king over in resignation, she couldn't help but smile. "You're extraordinary," she said quietly. David shook his head. "I'm just a man who learned how to see ahead." Caroline leaned closer. "No. You're more than that. You're someone who's been underestimated for far too long." That night marked the beginning of something neither of them expected. Caroline found herself seeking David out more often, asking about his life, sharing bits of hers, and learning to appreciate the honesty he carried. He wasn't dazzled by her wealth or her status. He treated her like a person, not a pedestal. And for Caroline, that was more refreshing than anything she had ever known. But not everyone saw it that way. Word of their late-night games spread quickly, fueling gossip. Executives whispered that the CEO was spending too much time with a janitor. Some mocked the idea, others worried about appearances. A few even hinted that it was beneath her. One afternoon, her head of operations, Richard Hayes, pulled her aside. "Caroline, people are starting to talk. This, friendship with Carter, it's unusual. You're the face of this company. Associating with staff at that level, it sends the wrong message." Caroline's jaw tightened. "And what message would that be, Richard?" "That I respect talent where I see it." That I don't judge people by their job titles. Richard shifted uncomfortably. It's not about respect. It's about perception. Investors. Investors don't run my life, she snapped, cutting him off. And maybe you should be more concerned with results than with who I play chess with. David overheard fragments of these conversations, and though he tried to hide it, he began to worry. He had never wanted to complicate her life or career. The last thing he wanted was to be the reason she lost credibility. That night, after yet another quiet game, David leaned back and sighed. Caroline, maybe we should stop this. Her brow furrowed. Stop what? Playing. Talking. Whatever this is. People are starting to notice, and it could hurt you. Caroline shook her head firmly. I don't care what people say. But you should, he said gently. You've worked your whole life for this. Don't let me be the reason people doubt you. For the first time, Caroline's voice softened with something like pleading. David, do you really think I care more about their gossip than I care about what's real? His chest tightened at her words. She was serious. And though he didn't say it, his heart whispered the same truth, she had become real to him too. Still, obstacles loomed. Richard wasn't the only one suspicious. A board member soon confronted Caroline during a meeting, questioning her judgment and subtly suggesting that her leadership might be compromised by personal entanglements. Caroline defended herself fiercely, but the tension grew. Behind closed doors, whispers turned into warnings, and warnings into veiled threats. And through it all, David wrestled with his own fears. Could a janitor and a CEO ever really belong together in a world so obsessed with titles and appearances? Or would he always be the shadow in her light, a reminder of everything people thought she shouldn't want? Caroline, however, had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let anyone dictate her happiness, not anymore. And soon, the world would see just how far she was willing to go for the man who beat her in 3 moves and captured her heart in the same breath. In the months that followed, the whispers around the company didn't fade, they transformed. What began as gossip turned into admiration when people realized Caroline wasn't backing down. She and David continued their evening chess games, but their conversations grew deeper than the moves on the board. David eventually shared his full story with her, the scholarships he gave up, the family he supported, the brilliance he set aside so others could survive. Caroline didn't pity him, she respected him even more. To her, David wasn't just a janitor. He was proof that true greatness can be hidden in the most unexpected places. When Caroline finally introduced David to the board of directors, not as a janitor, but as a consultant for strategic planning, the room was stunned. His ideas were sharp, his vision clear, and within months, his strategies saved the company millions. The same executives who once mocked him now leaned forward, eager to hear his thoughts. And through it all, Caroline stood by his side, not because of a joke about marriage, but because she had found someone who saw her not as a CEO, but as Caroline. Their story spread far beyond the walls of the company. Articles were written, interviews requested, and people everywhere were reminded of a powerful truth: talent, love, and dignity are not defined by job titles or wealth. Sometimes, the person we overlook is the one holding the key to everything we're missing. So if you take anything away from this story, let it be this: never underestimate the quiet ones. Never assume someone's worth by the uniform they wear or the title they hold. And never forget that life, like chess, can change in just a few moves. Because in the end, what matters most isn't power, or money, or status. What matters is the heart, and the courage to see beyond the board.